we should do this as we are sitting here, author and interviewer at the stage. Let's assume, since this is a Lusophone, Anglophone literature event, let's assume you and I, we sit in a cafe in Maputo. The cafe is crowded. We are forced to sit at the same table because there's no space everywhere else. We look at each other, it's a bit awkward, but we want to make nice, so we try to have a conversation. And so you are, as the polite person that you are, you introduce yourself, you say you are Jonny, and I ask you, nice to meet you, Jonny. Who are you?
Well, before we pretend that we're in Maputo, let's pretend we're in Nairobi. And hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Back to Maputo. Who am I? I am a South African, a white South African who experienced the dying years of apartheid as a young adult at university, watching on the front lines as a very dramatic moment in history came to a culmination. I went abroad during the transition to study. I studied in the UK. So I was not at home for 3 years. And then was deciding what to do with my life. Do I stay over there and become an academic? But it seemed that there was such great drama unfolding at home, and I really wanted...
Which years were this exactly?
So I was abroad from 95 to 98, so just after freedom came in 94. And it seemed that back home, everything was changing, but nobody knew exactly how. And when I say everything, I mean everything. You could stand on a street corner and look at the interactions between people, what was happening in hospitals and prisons, in all sorts of public institutions, in farms, in workplaces. The rules of engagement between people, particularly between black and white, were being rewritten. And I wanted to be there to record it. And to tell stories about it, and to share those stories primarily with fellow South Africans. I wanted to be a chronicler of those times for my fellow citizens, but also for a larger audience abroad. So you can ask somebody who they are, and there are 1,000 different answers, but that's the one that comes up in this coffee shop in Maputo.
Okay, thank you, Jonny. You said you wanted to be a chronicler of the times that were changing. That makes you, in a way, a historian. And you are currently a professor for African Studies at Oxford University, where you also teach African history. So what history do you teach?
Well, I primarily write about the present, not about the past. And I guess in that way, I'm not a historian. And I deal with all sorts of sources, but the primary sources I deal with are human beings. And my mode of operating is to write a story, a very intense, a very personal story about one human being. And the research process is to essentially drive that person crazy, is to arrive in that person's life, get permission to write about them and not go away, and be there for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and write a story about that interaction.
But I particularly wanted to know what you teach when you go into a classroom at Oxford University and you teach African history.
I don't teach African history. I teach largely about, well, I teach all sorts of things.
Because that is written on your university's website.
Oh no, it says African Studies, I think. Yeah,
and then you teach MSc students African history.
No.
So you have to go back to them and correct that.
We teach about all sorts of things. One of the things that we do is ask what colonialism was, and what sort of legacy it left. We also ask what happened in the 1960s and 70s across the continent, why things didn't go as planned, what happened. Also about Africa emerging in the world right now. Those are the big, broad questions we ask, but we ask very detailed questions about people's lives as well. What is human experience on this continent? What is pain and suffering, and what is happiness on this continent? What are life projects on this continent? So it's a broad range of questions that feed into the teaching that I do. Some from the deep past, many from the present.
But you started your professional life as a journalist. You were a journalist for the Business Daily, which is a national newspaper in South Africa. Now you're an author. You just had your 10th book out this month, which is one day in Bethlehem. It's not even available in Kenya. So unfortunately, we don't have it for you out there at the bookshop, but we have the other one. It was a bad timing maybe for the festival. And you're also a scholar. So was becoming a researcher and an academic that you are now a natural progression for you from journalism to what you're doing now?
I worked as a journalist for 15 months, but I don't think I defined myself as a journalist. I now work in a university as an academic, but don't define myself as an academic. I think that there are many different paths to telling stories and many different paths to knowledge. And there's a long canon of journalism and how to tell a story as a journalist, a long canon of scholarship on how to tell a story as a historian, as a sociologist. And I like to think that I can borrow from all of those things and be eclectic. Above all, I like to think that I'm a writer and a teacher. Journalist, academic are secondary. They're just the various forms in which those primary things can happen.
But the journalism was kind of your initiation to the writing process that you are now making the center of your life, I believe. And I feel your writing merges the best of the two worlds of both journalism and the scholarly research, because I feel you write with the skills acquired maybe as a journalist, which are the ability to condense information to the essence, and at the same time you have clarity of language. So a lot of academics write in a way that nobody understands because they only want to be understood by their peers. You don't do that at all. And you write with a depth that many a journalist dreams of being able to do, because what you do requires a lot of time and a lot of resources. How do you make this happen?
Well, when I was a journalist, that's what frustrated me most. There were daily deadlines, and the world around me was so very, very interesting, and I was getting to learn so much about it, but I couldn't reflect what I was learning on the page because the whole form of journalism didn't really allow one to go very much beneath the surface. So it was a really interesting time and also an incredibly frustrating time. Um, and what I did is I left my job and I started really earnestly raising money. And I think
How
that I
did you
was,
raise money?
well, I think that I was lucky that, at the time, South Africa was very, very topical around the world, and people wanted to know a lot about it. They wanted to invest in research in it. And I applied for a series of fellowships at various organizations, from the Ford Foundation and the Open Society Institute, a couple of Irish organizations. They were all competitive scholarships. I had to show what I was going to produce and compete. But I was lucky. I think I was lucky that at the time, what I was writing about was it was considered very urgent, across many parts of the world. And so, with a lot of hard work and dedication and taking some risks, I managed to write my first 3 books more or less full time. I had to do other work between the projects in order to pay the bills. But I was lucky enough to carve out space to work. The first book I worked 20 months full time, and the second one 2 years, the third one 2 years. So that was very fortunate.
Indeed, indeed. So you write, as you said yourself, you write non-fictional books, actually anthropological books in a way, with yourself as the narrator. Why did you choose that route?
Well, I grew up in South Africa. It is an enormously divided country. There are so many worlds of experience. There are hundreds of worlds of experience, separated by all sorts of inequalities, by race, by language. And I guess the main question that I faced when putting pen to paper is, how do I know what I know? How do I have the authority to write about worlds that are not my own, that intersect with mine, that influence mine, but are not mine? And I thought the primary way to get authority is for the reader to say, I can understand why this person knows what he does, is to place myself at the center of the story. I think also because I was entering worlds that were very unfamiliar to me, what I learned most and deepest was in people's relation to me. And they were always very intense, very fraught, very difficult relationships. They were about power, unequal power between me and the people I was writing about. They were about race. They were about class. And it seems to me that so much of my country was condensed into these relationships that I was forming and doing the research that it just seemed obvious that that's what I should write about. And it wasn't in order to make me the center of the story. I think my presence in my books is not equal to the presence of the people I'm writing about. I'm kind of this shadow figure. I don't explore myself, I explore them. But it's through their relation to me that I begin to understand them. So that's why I'm there. And if I can give a quick example. So, a book called Three-Letter Plague, it takes place in the middle of the AIDS epidemic. And it's about a young man who's 29 years old. He believes that he is HIV positive. The state-of-the-art antiretroviral treatment program comes to his village. He can see that it works, and yet he won't test for HIV. And the book explores why. That seems quite paradoxical, quite strange. And the answer I came to was quite complicated. He was getting ahead in life. He'd opened a business. He was doing well. He was starting to get richer than his peers. And he felt a great deal of shame that he was accumulating money. He felt deep inside him that it wasn't right. And in a complicated way, in his mind, the shame he felt for getting rich was connected to sexual shame for sleeping with too many women. And he believed that there was a virus in his blood. His shame took the form of dirty blood. And I discovered his shame. It's a very intimate, very close thing. How do you reach that? How do you find something that personal? And the way I found it was through his relation to me. He felt shameful that he was cooperating with me. At one point, after a very long time, after spending 2 years together, he said, what I'm doing is I'm giving you black people's secrets that white people should not know, and I feel shamed about that. And that relation of shame in connection to me was connected to why he wouldn't test for HIV in a complicated way. It was about the shame of sex, the shame of money, the shame of what he was doing with me, all mixed together. And it only emerged through a very intimate relationship with him. So I had to write about his relationship to me to understand him.
How did you even reach this state that you could describe your relationship with him as that personal and that intimate? What did you do? How did you get under his skin? Or what? Where did you go?
I think it's two things. The one is time. You spend a lot of time with somebody. But the other is even more simple. I mean, somebody is written about because they want to be written about, and they don't always know why.
People want to tell their stories.
Yeah, and I guess one reason is quite simple. I arrive in somebody's life, and I'm more interested in them than anybody has ever been before. I hang on to their every word. I'm interested in every relationship they've ever had, every person they've ever had. There is something quite beguiling about that sort of intense interest, and I think that people get seduced by it, and that's one of the reasons why people lend hundreds of hours of their time over a period of years to a project like this. There is something quite strangely flattering about it. It's a very dangerous relationship because when they're spending all this time with me, they're always imagining in the back of their mind what they're going to look like on the page. They're almost constructing a personality that's going to be a character that's going to be in a book. And then they read the book and it's not what they imagined. And they can feel betrayed, they can feel pain, they can feel disappointment.
Exactly. That is one thing every journalist in his or her training learns. Don't just take an answer just as an answer. So you have to find other sources to verify what you were just told. So how do you verify how a person describes his or her personality? How do you know that the person, even about him or herself, tells you or is genuine, is truthful to you?
Well, I don't think that you're out to trick somebody. I don't think you're out to say, well, you've told a story about yourself and it's wrong. Every one of us, we tell stories about ourselves, and they're always partly fictitious, they're partly constructed, they're partly self-serving. And I think that's just a fact about human identity. And when you're listening to somebody's story, whether you're writing about them, whether you're talking to them on a stage, whether you're having coffee with them, you're always wondering at the back of your mind, how has this person constructed himself and why? And so it's just a natural series of questions one would ask about anybody, really.
But how do you reach the point when you feel the idea that I have, the picture that I have formed for myself about this person is now what I can comfortably put down on the paper? Because then once it's there, you can't change it anymore.
Again, it's a question of time. I mean, any impression you have of anybody is provisional. It can always change. But I'm always struck by the notes that I took on the first day or the first week or the first month and compare them with what I think 2 years later. And the first impressions are almost always wrong. So really, it's. I mean, I keep stressing it, but time is the real time, intensity, um, commitment. I mean, those are the important things.
Okay. You write in research, as you also mentioned, about the people of South Africa, and let's say one and a half of your books are not about South Africans. One is A Little Liberia, where you um, portray two Liberians living in New York City as refugees who arrived there at different times. And the second one is half because it is a story about a Somali refugee, but you are interviewing him in South Africa, and there's a lot of South Africa in this book as well.
And some Nairobi.
And some, I'm coming to that later on, yes. Um, you explained earlier why you got into this immediately after the democratic transition in South Africa, but now this is 25 years later. Of course, there are always still questions to ask and to answer, but are you also considering other subjects than South Africa or South Africans?
Yeah, well, I wrote the book about the Liberians to get away from South Africa. I felt I don't know how you feel about Kenya, but I feel that South Africans get into an incredibly inward-turned, claustrophobic discussion about ourselves. Um, and I very much wanted to snap out of that conversation and enter a completely different world. Um, and what was attractive about this story is that, so I stumbled across it by chance. And a friend of mine who lived and worked in New York told me about a housing project in the middle of New York, which was housed entirely by Liberian refugees. And he spent a day with these people, and he said that he got the strange sense that they transported the civil war in Liberia across the ocean and were fighting it on the streets of New York. Um, and that seemed very interesting to me. I like the idea of a conflict that is crossing an ocean. What happens over time? What happens over distance? What happens with moving? Um, so I went to live in New York for 2 years and spent most of that time in this housing project and ended up writing a dual biography about two men who were at war with each other on the streets of New York. And I traced their respective histories back into Liberia and tried to tell a story about the history of modern Liberia by telling these two men's stories. Um, so it was a way of exploring what happens when people jump over an ocean, what they take with them and what they leave behind. Um, and yeah, it was. I'm not sure it was my most successful book, but I'm very pleased that I did it. It was getting to know Liberia in particular was a very dramatic experience for me. It's a very dramatic country with an extraordinary, painful, recent history, and getting to know it was quite a privilege.
And after that, you went back to South Africa. So this was enough break for you. And now, right now, you're writing a book about Winnie and Nelson Mandela. So again, South Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Well, who knows what the future brings? But for the moment, that's what I'm stuck with. That's what I keep getting drawn to.
Okay.
Although A Man of Good Hope was, I don't know. Maybe you want to discuss it later, but that was.
I wanted to discuss it now. Okay. Yeah, but so go ahead. What you wanted to say?
Well, that book is not about a South African. It's about a Somali who ended up in South Africa. So it is about South Africa, but about many other things. So this was a man. His name is Asad Abdullahi. He was born in Mogadishu, and when he was 8 years old in 1991, he had to flee and ended up living this incredibly deracinated, itinerant existence, moving across the Horn of Africa as a child. He lived in Nairobi for 3 years, in Eastleigh, just around the corner from here. He lived in Addis Ababa, in Dire Dawa. He moved through the Ogaden Desert. And through all of that time, he was becoming a very hard person. He was never attached to any particular adult. He'd make these alliances with adults, calculating who was going to help him, where he'd receive love and kindness. And when he was 19 years old, he was finally making it. He was a hustler on the streets of Addis Ababa, sort of negotiating between people and accumulating money and getting these American dollars in his pocket. And what he did with those dollars is he left. Without documents, with $1,200, with a couple of changes in clothes, he went south to South Africa because he heard there was a lot of money to be made there. And the book documents his childhood, his journey to South Africa, and then what happened when he got to South Africa.
But What I find the most impressive about this book and previous books, like the one you mentioned, Little Liberia, you don't just write it down. You don't just document what you were told. You actually go to the places he told you about. Even with sometimes, like in the Man of Good Hope, he scribbled where he lived in Mogadishu. He scribbled the courtyard where his house was, where the other buildings around his former home were. And you went there and looked for the people he was talking about. You went to Addis, as you said, and looked for the people he was talking about. Why?
Well, so all these travels, on the one hand, they were a failure because what I was trying to do, I had his story about his past. And the reason I wrote a book all about him is he's the most extraordinary storyteller I've ever met. He really is a genius. His capacity to use smell, to use taste, above all, to use symbol and metaphor to organize his stories. He really was a massively gifted narrator of his own life. And primarily, I wanted the privilege of writing a book which celebrated his narration. But the problem is, it's his narration, and just by virtue of storytelling, much of it couldn't have been true. And part of what I wanted to do was go to the places to find people who knew him and get other perspectives on his life. And that was only partially successful. He's the sort of person who leaves few traces. And I met a couple of people who remembered him. In London, I met people who knew quite a lot about his family. History was important. But that part of the project was really a failure. All I was left with was his story about himself and very few others. But there was something else about going here to Eastleigh, going to Diradawa, to Addis. And I can't really describe what it is, but it's just the physicality of being in the places where he was. It's very, very important. And I can't really reduce to words why it's important. It's about a sense, it's about a feeling. And I know that it gets transported into the writing, but I don't know how.
You feel you were successful in transporting this feeling into your writing?
Well, I'm the last one to judge the success of something that I've written, but I feel that it changed what I wrote. I feel I couldn't have written the way I did about his childhood unless I'd been there.
And you, as you mentioned, went to Eastleigh to trace his story.
Yeah.
Maybe you can share your experience with Eastleigh a little bit, because we are Nairobians, many of us at least, I believe.
Yeah.
And I hope many of you have also been to Eastleigh, because this is part of the city. So what was your impression as a South African of Eastleigh?
Well, let me first explain how he got to Eastleigh. Okay. So he was living in...
But remember, we still want to sell your book, yeah?
Of course, yeah, no. Well, well, any half-decent book is in the writing, so you can tell the whole story and people should start.
So please, yeah.
So he was living in the Dadaab refugee camps in northeast Kenya, being looked after by a distant relative. She managed to get a refugee card to go to America, but he didn't. And so she abandoned him. She left him behind. And he arrived in Nairobi knowing nobody. But being Somali, not his clan, but his sub-clan leaded him where to go. And it turned out that his sub-clan occupied a building in Eastleigh. And he spent 3 years living in this building. He had no particular parents. He'd sleep one night with one family, one night with another family. And this combination of belonging to everybody but to nobody was really interesting. He was a very lonely child. He was a very angry child. He needed the love of one or two adults rather than the dispersed, distracted kindness of everybody.
Maybe remind us at what age he was when he was in Eastleigh.
Oh, sorry. So I think it was from the age 9 to 12. So the first thing I did was went to Eastleigh and looked for this building. Eastleigh is such a mercurial, liquid, fast-changing place that building was now something completely different. And there was absolutely no trace of his sub-clan having occupied that place. They were gone. There were a couple of people who had vague memories of the leaders of that building at the time, but they were old people. Their memories were very disturbed. And you just got the sense of how fast movement is in that place, how generations wash in and wash out. And that was his sense of it too. He lived there from 9 till 12, and then he ran away and escaped and ended up in Ethiopia. And he ended up coming back, passing through 6 years later, and barely recognized the place. And part of that is an expression of what the Somali diaspora is. It's very entrepreneurial, it's very moving, it's very liquid. The places where it settles change very quickly. It's a real sense of a diasporic sense of this world, of a constant movement. partly shaped by civil war, but partly by a very old history.
Did you speak to people in Eastleigh when you were interviewing them on the issue of home? Because you just mentioned how fluid you experienced Eastleigh to be. People come, people go, people are entrepreneurial because they have to find a way to survive. And since this festival is also about the sense of belonging and sense of home, and you describe Eastleigh as something where one would not necessarily find it. So did you have discussions where people raised this issue of I'm looking for a place to put my roots down, or do I feel at home here or not? Something like that?
Eastleigh is a very complicated place. Firstly, it's not just Somali. There's a very large Oromo community there. And given what's happening in Ethiopia today, things are very fluid and fragile around that community. But I think that for many people who live in Eastleigh, home is a geographically fragmented place. Most people are in both economic and family relationships, which are splintered across various parts of the world. From Eastleigh to Somalia, to the United Arab Emirates, to places in Northern Europe, to America. And all of these are possibilities. All of these are places one might go to. And so home really isn't a strict geographical place. Home is 7 or 8 possible places when one might move to, depending on what the opportunities are and how one is calculating. It's not just geographically spread, it's spread from the developing world to the developed world. It's a very, very complex geography.
But this is not Jonny Steinberg talking. I want to know, did people in Eastleigh talk to you about home and belonging? When you had conversations with them, did they raise this issue? And if yes, what did they say?
I spent a short time in Eastleigh, and it was for a very specific purpose. It was to find Assad's people. And so I didn't have long conversations with people about home. But I had long conversations with Assad and with people around him about home. And this sense that, in a way, there's a paradox. For some, this is obviously not true of all Somalis. There are many different ways, thousands of ways of being Somali. But Assad's way of being Somali was geographically very unrooted. At times he said, "What is Somalia? I haven't been there since I was 8 years old. I probably won't go back. It's not home. And yet I am Somali, so what does it mean if there isn't a geographical referent for that?" And his answer to that was very complicated. His answer was, on the one hand, it's in my lineage. I'm Ogadeni, and I'm an Abdullahi. And I can name the generations of my ancestors going back into ancient times. But he also deeply resented being an Ogadeni. He also found it constricting. At one point in his life, I don't want to give too much of the book away, he wanted to marry a woman who his family frowned upon. And he felt that lineage to be constricted. So what home was very partial, very paradoxical, very detached from his sense of who he was. It's a really complicated business.
So at the end of your book, Assad ends up in Kansas City, where he's being resettled. And resettlement, that this term in itself touches this issue of home and finding a place where you put your roots down already. So Assad has a very interesting way to put where home is, and I would like to ask you to read this short part. So this occurs when you visit him in Kansas City, when he has just settled down there, when his wife had a baby, and they just came out of the hospital. They just came out of the hospital. So Assad talks to you and tells you about the wife and the baby and him. They just got home and they had barely settled in that the social worker knocks at the door. So would you kindly read that part?
Okay. This is Assad speaking. I'm staring at the social worker. She sees me staring. She says, "This is your American daughter." It sounded so strange to me. I said, "No, she's not my American daughter. She's my daughter." The social worker laughed. She said, "Yes, she's your daughter, but she's your American daughter." I didn't like it when she said it, but she is right. Where is home? Somalia? I can't even go to Somalia. How can you call a place you cannot go to home? Home is where the social security is, brother. Home is where the social workers knock on the door because they do not want you to kill your baby by mistake.
Could you comment on that?
Well, what goes through my mind is what Assad thinks of America now.
Please tell us.
When he went there, he'd been dreaming about going to America for years. In South Africa, he'd been subjected to violence again and again and again. He'd been living in a refugee camp. His idea was that America is where you can finally rest, where you can finally begin to build something. He had this idea that for his life to mean anything, he would have to do something with his few years on this earth, which was going to change the rest of the history of his family forever. And he thought that America is the place where I'll have the space to do that. And his first impressions of America were really just the fulfillment of his fantasy. Firstly, he couldn't get over how much he was watched in America, how there was this big information sapping apparatus that saw whatever he did. So for instance, if he'd speed, he'd get a ticket. And if he'd speed twice, he'd get another. And a third time, he'd have his license taken away. And he was really worried about that. He was watched. You can't make any mistake. Something, you're going to get thrown out. So you're going to get things taken away. But then the second sense of being watched was when his wife went into labor, he picked up the phone. And before he put down the phone, he heard the ambulance siren. And he thought, wow, there's the city which is actually geared up to respond to my needs. And the epiphany for him was the social worker. He didn't ask them to come around. They're collecting data in the city. How do cot deaths happen? How do we prevent it? There was this whole machinery out there preventing him from accidentally killing his child. So he thought, I've arrived in heaven. There's this contract. You play by the rules and you get looked after. That was after a few months. He's now realized that America's not quite like that. And in so many ways, I mean, the first thing he discovered in America is that he lived in a black neighborhood and he himself was considered black. And his politics of race are very complicated. He had never considered himself black before. He'd considered himself Somali. He'd considered the people south of Somalia black and not him. And he was caught up in a society where he was in a minority, and the forces raging against that minority were very powerful, and he had no choice about that. But the other thing that caught up with him in America was not just American society, but his own history. And so he arrived with a wife and children, and the first thing he did was get a job as a truck driver. He spent his teenage years as a truck driver, moving through the Ogaden. And so here he was, ostensibly settled, living with a family, but actually moving all the time, as he always had done before. And within a couple of years, he was divorced and alone again. And now he has a truck, and he moves throughout America. Each day he could be in Chicago, he could be in Los Angeles. So there's a very powerful sense in which his history has shaped him, that he can't stop moving, he can't stop detaching, he can't stop being alone. A very, very powerful sense in what happened to him as a child is now with him forever, and he's going to keep repeating the life that he's lived.
Are you still in touch with him?
Yeah.
So where is he now, and how does he feel about America now?
Well, he lives in Minneapolis, and he feels that America is tough. He feels that in a qualified sense he succeeded. He owns his own truck. He's an independent businessman.
Does he have American citizenship now?
No, I think he has a green card, but not yet citizenship as far as I know. But this idea of settling enough to be able to build something for future generations, I think is probably going to elude him forever. It's an important anchor in his mind, but it will probably never be realized in reality.
Oh, I've read a couple of your books, and A Man of Good Hope has struck me in particular because, as we mentioned earlier, you are the narrator in your books, but I also feel your books are very personal, if not almost intimate, and the most personal of your own statements about what writing this book, what this encounter with Assad meant to you, was in the epilogue, of A Man of Good Hope. And if I may ask you to read that part as well.
I have spent the last couple of years memorializing his life, but there is no intrinsic value in remembering. He has in fact just told me that he cannot afford to take in the sweep of his life. To remember in this way is crippling. It is better for him, I think, to see the past as a series of sparks or flashes, a selection of moments when he was the one who decided what would happen next. That is what he must see in his past in order to craft a future. This book is for me and for those who read it. It is of no value to him, but for the money that will come his way. He will buy a track with that money or part of a track. From this book, he will fashion another moment when he is the one who decides. Can I maybe explain it a little bit there? So, I wrote a draft of this book and gave it to him to read, to see what he thought. And he never read it. He couldn't read it. And it took a long time, a lot of discussion to find out why he wouldn't read it. And in the end, the answer was really illuminating. Essentially, he understood his life as, the metaphor he used is, I spent my whole boyhood being kicked around like a stone. I was not the one who was going to decide what happened next. I had no traction in this world. And he cannot afford to see his past that way if he's going to have traction in the present, if he's going to have any agency. And here was this book that laid out his past as a continuous story. And he said, I can't afford to see that story in order to exist now, in order to act now. There are huge parts of my past I don't want to know or think about. And so this book just isn't helpful for me. It's not a conception of my past that is going to be usable. And in that moment, I just understood how he does see his past. He wants to forget most of it. He wants to remember those flashes, those moments when he had real power, when he decided the trajectory, where he decided what was going to happen next. That was quite a revelation to me. We live in a culture where remembering is highly valued. Remembering is therapeutic. Remembering is being healthy. I think he taught me the opposite, that it's often very important to forget.
When you started the book, did you think about whether it could have value for him? Or was it just, I want to tell a story?
It was more, I want to tell a story, and the task of telling a good story is hard enough.
But now, since you were telling or trying to tell a good story as a narrator, and then you just said he himself was the greatest storyteller you've ever met, was there kind of a conflict? Was there a competition between the narrator storyteller and the storyteller? How was that relationship?
No, his wonderful storytelling allowed me to tell the story that I did. There was a symbiotic relationship in that sense.
Okay. Your next book, One Day in Bethlehem, as I mentioned earlier, is again about South Africa and two South Africans, two men who were jailed for 19 years, even though they were innocent. And you tell their story, and also after they were released from prison, how they seek justice for the injustice that was done to them. And do you think that, in your opinion, are justice and having the sense of belonging, or having the sense of this is my home, connected?
They can be, but they're not necessarily. This man I wrote about, Fusi Mofokeng, came out of prison after 19 years and walked into the world where the township where he'd grown up, and thought, this is not my home. And the reason is not that injustice was committed against him, but because his mother and his brother were dead, and they were most important people in his life. And that speaks very profoundly to what home is. Home is much more than a geographical place. It's the people around you who see you and make you what you are. And I think we often don't realize how profoundly true that is, that we exist because of the way others see us. We exist because others hold us in our gaze. Yes. And he walked into a world which geographically was familiar to him. It was his home. But the two people in the world who made him who he was were gone. And he actually couldn't believe that they were gone. He had to go to the cemetery and see their graves and spend time alone there and really try to internalize that they were no longer there.
But here again, you bring up the issue of memory. And for Assad, memory was painful and was something he didn't want to deal with, or didn't want to have in his life. And now you're writing a book about a person who holds memory very dearly in order to feel at home.
But it's not true that Assad didn't want memory. We all need memory. We'd disintegrate. We'd have no self without memory. It's the sort of memory he wanted. It was a very, very selective memory. It was looking back into his past and seeing 5 or 7 or 8 flashes of moments that made him who he was. So I think that there there's one word, memory, but many different things go under that sign.
Indeed. Okay. So maybe we open up the floor to questions. If you have questions or comments, please try to make it short. Please tell your name, and let's take two questions at a time. Yeah.
Good morning, and
Hi.
thank you for the presentation. My name is Lucy Muli, and I teach at a university. My question is about the stories that you tell. I mean, obviously, you're going to try and capture the story and make it as truthful as you possibly can. Are you ever, at the end of your story, in doubt or uncertain that you have told the story as it is and not so much as an interpretation of what you think it should be? And have people ever come back and said, I know you say, they say, well, that's not really my story, but have ever said, did you ever feel that I didn't quite capture the story, I didn't tell the right story?
Yeah, I mean, that's always an anxiety. And in Assad's case, it was doubly complicated because there was not only that anxiety, but there was the fact that I was unable to triangulate. I was unable to get other people's evidence of who he was when he was a child, and all I had was his memory. And without saying so directly to the reader, what I hoped to do was simply say, this is not the factual history of his life. This is his memory. And it's therefore part fantasy. It's part story. And you can really see by the character of the story, by the characters in the story, that it's inside somebody rather than in the world, particularly the women in the story. After a while, I noticed that every woman who appears in Assad's childhood is either completely angelic or completely evil. So these are not real people. These are people that his imagination has fashioned. And so I, without saying explicitly, I want the reader to know we're talking about the inside of a man's imagination rather than his actual empirical experience. But that's fine. The story of what happens inside one's head is important and real enough. But thanks for the question. Well, I think that without trying to get too complicated, I think that there are two different senses of the word truth. And the one is empirically, factually. Did X walk into a shop on the 5th of January and shoot somebody? Is that true or not? I mean, that's one factual truth. The other is an interpretational truth. So, for instance, I was talking about this man, Sizwe, who didn't test for HIV because he felt that he had this poison in his blood, and that the result was shame. It was the result of shame. That was my interpretation. Is that interpretation right or wrong? Well, that's open to dispute. I can't say for certain that I'm right. It's an interpretive truth. I can try and show the reader how I got there, try and make the process I went through as transparent as possible.
My name is Otieno. Thank you so much for the very engaging conversation. My question also is about Assad. He displays what Nurdin Farah calls Somali exceptionalism, that Somalis are quite exceptional. And because you also show that very well in the book, I was wondering how that, with your own politics of of race and things like that, how did you navigate that when writing the book?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a really interesting question. And I hope this isn't a cop-out, but I think that there are ways in which we're all exceptional in relation to each other and in ways in which we're all not. I think that the fact that Assad and I were both human meant that there was a great deal of imaginative overlap between us. There was really a place we could be together and understand. But there were other parts of his experience which, from my vantage point, were truly radically exceptional. And if I can point to two of those, one is his sense of history and his sense of time. And if you ask me about my ancestry, I can tell you all about my parents. I can tell you quite a lot about my grandparents. After that, things start getting a bit fuzzy. My great-parents, not sure. My great-great-parents, I can tell you nothing about it all. They're completely lost to me. Assad, you ask him about his history, and he'll name 26 generations. And so he has a sense of the past and of his connection to the past that I don't have. And in that sense, we're very different. And I really need to ask myself what that meant. What does it mean to be a human being carrying around this connection to a deep past, which is not in my own experience? How can I get into his shoes? How can I understand what that means for the actions that he takes? Another way in which we were very different is he very often risked his life. He would have a choice. Would he go back into a South African township and open another business where he may get killed? Or would he go back with his wife to Somaliland? And each time he chose danger. And that was something else that was unfamiliar to me. I don't choose life-threatening danger. And I wanted to know why. So it was really in honing in on what I didn't understand or what was beyond my experience and trying to think as hard as I could about that in my view, the book was most productive in trying to imagine a being who was not me, who was really very different to me. And in the end, I found those things deeply connected. His sense of deep time, his sense of a deep past, and his willingness his propensity to take great risk. So that's a really interesting question, and it was the question that exercised me the most while writing that book.
Hi, my name is Patricia. I wanted to ask that you mentioned how you write nonfiction, but you don't consider yourself a historian. While in a country that's as young as South Africa, where they've only had independence for about 25 years, there's still a lot of things like how people support the ANC just based off that was seen as Madiba's party. The women's protests that are marked on an entirely different day on the calendar in South Africa than internationally. The politics that defined one generation in comparison to the current generation who are against a lot of the former parties and ideologies that they carried. Like, how do you separate how that's affecting your characters, or the people you write stories about, and being a historian? Because that does carry some historical weight.
That's such an amazing question. And I was lucky enough, the way I interpret your words is to say the very fact that you've spoken the words you have today, the very fact that you've chosen that language is a measure of how much time has passed since freedom in South Africa. The words that you were saying were pretty close to unimaginable 10, 15 years ago in South Africa. You're expressing a distance and a skepticism about the moment of freedom and what it means, which is new. And in the course of researching this book, it's always artificial to say this, but I think there was a moment, I think there was a threshold which South Africans crossed from being a people who still believed in the narrative of liberation to people who've grown skeptical of it. And I think that it happened in the middle of this research process. So I saw the meanings of familiar things change. And as a writer, that's so lucky. So this book takes place in a small town in rural South Africa. And when I began the book, the fact that the mayor was a black man who drove a fancy car was very much a symbol of hope, very much a symbol that things were going to change, because this was a man who came from the poor township, and you could watch his rise, and everybody could take the journey with him. Everybody could say, this man is familiar to us, and look what's become of him. It could happen to us too. The whole narrative was one of rising. And by the time I'd finished writing the book, the mayor driving through the township in his car was a source of anger. He's made us and he's closed the door behind him, and we're stuck. And to watch that happen so quickly, it happened in the mid-years of Jacob Zuma's presidency in South Africa, but to watch it happening in the minds of the same people and to be there to record it through the process is a really privileged position. So you're absolutely right. One is writing history, and one is getting a sense of what can change over time. And I was lucky to be at this ridge, this moment where you could actually see the change, where it isn't invisible, it isn't incremental, it actually happens before your eyes.
Okay, mine, there are several questions. One,
One at a time.
they are all
The other
intertwined.
question. So,
One
yeah.
is consent. Did you seek consent from him to write his story? And number,
Sorry, I didn't get that.
consent. Did you like seek consent from him to write his story?
Oh, consent.
That's one.
Right.
Do you share proceeds of sales with him? And what struck you in this particular person to spend your time, your money, traveling around the world to tell the story of this person and not maybe another person like maybe Barack Obama or something? And
Okay,
why are you
let's answer
avoiding
this
the word
question first.
biography? The word biography is not mentioned anywhere in our discussion, yet this is some sort of biography. And
Thank you. So I mean, the first question. I mean, for me, there's an ethical puzzle which I don't think that I have solved, and which I'm not sure is solvable. But when somebody like me, who is a privileged middle class person, wants to write a very intimate book about somebody who is poorer than I am, and for the books that I write to work, they need to be intimate. There's an extent to which they extend into people's private sphere. What sort of transaction must pass between us? And the one answer is I cannot possibly offer this person money because then I'd be buying their soul, I'd be buying their privacy, and that is wrong. But then there's another answer to say that this book is going to make some money, and why should it all be mine and not his? And those are both very valid answers, and yet they contradict each other. And until this book with Assad, I've always tried to have it both ways. I've started working with somebody and said, look, there's no money here. You know, either you do this for free or not at all. And they consent for whatever reason, often quite complicated. When I've written a draft, I give them to read. We go through what the implications would be. And then when the book's about to be published, then I say, well, can I offer you a percentage? And then in my mind, I've had it both ways. I've got somebody's story without paying for it, but I'm also not getting all the proceeds myself. You know, I'd been doing that for years. By the time it took to working with Assad, I was quite tired of that. It felt like very elaborate and condescending. It was like I was controlling what was going on. And so I simply said to him at the beginning, we'll make a deal. I will give you a quarter of the proceeds if you will work with me. And I gave him, I didn't know how much money that would be. I gave him a sense of what it might be. And he agreed. And if I hadn't have offered him that, he wouldn't have worked with me. And I don't think that there's a simple ethical answer to that. I don't think it's good to buy somebody's story, but I don't think it's good to get it for free either. So I worked it out differently in each book. That's how I worked it out in this one. Your second question about biography. You know, I'm very, very wary about labeling books. I think that can close down what they are. I mean, these are obviously biographical books, but there are other things too. You know, they're contemporary history, they're narratives of the present. So yes, there's absolutely a biographical aspect to them. But I'm not avoiding the word biography. I'm just thinking that there are other things as well besides biographies.
And he wanted to know how you choose your.
Oh, that's right. Why not Barack Obama? No, but I think that's also a really important question. This book, these two men, in the last years of apartheid, the security police knocked on their door, dragged them away, and they didn't come out for 19 years. And I wrote about one of them and not the other. And the reason is that one of them was articulate, was philosophical, was interesting to me, and the other one was not. And in a sense, I wrote about the one, there's a 300-page book about him because he has a voice already. There isn't a 300-page book about the other one because he struggles to have a voice, because he suffers, because of his pain. And in that sense, that hugely restricts who I write about. I write about people who are able to project themselves in the world, who have a degree of togetherness, of wherewithal. And that's a very powerful process of selection. There are people silenced in the book I write because they suffer, because I can't hear them. And that's a very important thing that I need to acknowledge.
Hello, my name is Anne. So I have a first question. It's about homophobic attack in South Africa. I would like to know, how do you feel about those attacks as a South African person?
So I spoke a little about that. When was it? Last night? The night before? Um, I think that's it's a really hard one, as you can tell by my long pause. Um, I think that the people who carry out those attacks are very marginal people. There are people who are at the edges of South African cities. There are people who are struggling. And I think that the connection between the fact that they're struggling and the fact that they're committing this violence is important to acknowledge. And I think that some of what is happening is that they're angry with the system. They're angry, very much connected to your question. There's a great deal of disillusion. There's a seeping away of the magic of liberation, and it leaves people angry and frustrated. And yet they can't really get to the people they're really angry with because those people are protected. They're behind walls, they have bodyguards, they're protected by their wealth. But the people most proximate are precisely foreign nationals in their midst, and people who are capitalists, people who are accumulating, people who are selling them things. And I think that Somalis and Nigerians and others get attacked because they're the most proximate people there. And that doesn't condone it at all. That doesn't make it right at all. But I think it's important to understand that this is much deeper than a hatred of somebody because of their nationality. It has everything to do with the political and economic condition within which marginal South Africans find themselves in and who they can lash out to and who they can't.
So you have been writing about South African problems and violence happening there, and this can be connected to apartheid. So would you like to write a book about those attacks, those homophobic attacks connecting to apartheid?
That's what this book is about. The book about Assad. Assad was a victim of these attacks again and again and again, and that's the central subject matter of the book.
The subjects of your, my name is Ogutu, the subjects of your stories are often people who've been through trauma. How do you, in your process of engaging with them, how do you deal with the psychological aspects of that? To be careful not to re-traumatize them, or when things come up that are, difficult to deal with, how do you work that out? And also, how do you then detach from this person after building such a long, it's like 2-year relationship with them?
Well, on the first part of your question, I generally don't ask sensitive questions, and if the person, him or herself, goes there, then I'm lucky, and if they don't, then I'm not. Generally, the people who've chosen to work with me are talkers, and they want to talk, and they probably do so because in some way they find it therapeutic. And so I think that generally the people who end up spending 2 or 3 years with me end up needing to relive these things, and in a sense self-selecting. But I would, I never once asked Assad about a moment of violence or an intimate moment between himself and his wife. I waited for those to come. If the circumstances arose and he entered that terrain, then I would follow him there and ask questions. But I think that and there's something self-interested about that. If you're too pushy and too nosy, somebody doesn't want to talk to you anymore. So all of it's in the rapport and in the atmosphere between you. The second is, to be honest, the process of writing about somebody is a form of detachment from them. It's a form of distancing. And that's not always recognized, but to put somebody on a page is to stand away from them. And I can feel that happening. When, the last thing I do is finish writing the book, and I can feel that person drifting from me. I'm seeing them less often. Where I'm seeing them is on the page, and I'm moving on somewhere else. Part of my head is elsewhere. So I think there's a distancing built into the rhythm of the process.
Okay, my name is Gerald Kithinji, and I would like to make a comment before I ask the question. On the stage where you are, back in the 70s and late 60s, there were South Africans acting here. And we acted with them here they stayed with us until apartheid was dismantled. I'm asking this, of the diasporans, of the South Africans that went out and lived out and came back after Mandela came out, has any one of them written a book as a response to what is happening in South Africa at the moment? I'm saying this because I've been following the South African issues, although not very closely. I wrote a poem about Nelson Mandela back in the 70s. And so I would like to know, is there somebody responding and saying, look, we were treated out there not so badly, like in Kenya here, they enjoyed themselves. They were, George Menoe was here, Kambuna was here, and they even got married here. Okay. So that's what I would like to know, whether there's a response from people who lived out during the apartheid days.
So there's a very interesting dialogue about that exact question in South Africa, a very interesting dialogue, because it's a constant refrain in South Africa where people say, how can you do this to foreign nationals when they hosted us in exile? And often the response of people in the streets to that is, they didn't host us, they hosted you. They hosted an elite. You were able to travel. We were stuck here. So it's a way of giving expression to divisions in South African society. To say, don't give us that stuff about foreign nationals hosting us. It wasn't us, it was you. We're not the same as you. So it goes back to your comment. It's an era in which there's a great deal of skepticism about the discourse of freedom. And that's one of the areas in which it finds expression.
In the previous talk, they had mentioned how they let the characters come to them and they kind of like research into that. But I'm really interested to find out how you find the people that you do write about and what's the process like of just learning their stories and maybe visiting the same places that they've been, if it's possible.
Yeah, so you, firstly, how find the people to write about? You know, it's a little different each time, but usually what is there's an issue that I want to write about. So in one case it was, in the very first book, it was the murder of white farmers on their land and what was going on. The second one was what's happening in prisons. The third one was HIV. So generally I find a subject matter and then look for people to write about. And it's quite a difficult process because I don't have all the time in the world. I raise money for each book and the money's going to run out. So I need to start writing soon. But then at the same time, you have to find the right person. So it's generally about going in, meeting people, and very quickly trying to ascertain, you know, who here is crazy enough to want to spend the next 2 years with me? Who wants to do that? And generally, if you find somebody who does want to do that, they are going to be interesting. They are going to sustain a book just because of their willingness to go through that process.
Okay. Any other question or comment? We have maybe time for 2 more, if there are any.
Hello, my name is Josephine. I teach at the French school. Maybe a comment and a question about the notion of home. The notion of home, first of all, and then the writer and writing as a therapy. So writing is a therapy, reading as well. Obviously, as seen from the continent here, you have seen it's been recurrent, you know, we can't detach ourselves from the fact that, you know, we ask ourselves, for South Africans, what is home? What does home mean for them? And, you know, because, I mean, the biggest irony is South Africa has got Africa in it. And so what does home mean for, you know, for South Africans? And probably from how they've been reacting to the people who come from the continent, obviously we would have an impression that that home stops somewhere that we do not recognize, because he asked a question about the fact that, when you say they were hosted here, for me, it's not even they were hosted. I remember about 30 years ago when I was in sixth form, and we are discovering South Africa with the stories of Biko, and we are in the streets, and we are also more than, and we were doing that because for us, that was part of us, that was home for us. So what is home for a South African? And then secondly, as a writer, do you consider yourself a little bit as a therapist? And probably could we be counting on you writers, also to probably be part of what could really bring the answer to the idea and the notion of home for those people back home? Thank you.
To your first question, I can only really repeat my answer to the question at the front, which is that, a great deal depends not on saying in the abstract, Africans were united against apartheid, but who is saying it? And in South Africa, who is saying it are political people, privileged people. And so it's as much a response to who is saying it as to the content of what they're saying. And so when people reply, we are not Africans because we were never freed, you were saying that we're united in the continent for freedom, but we're not free, so we're not united with the continent. It's very much an internal South African dialogue. Who are you to tell us what to think when you are the problem? So I think that's the best way to understand how people are answering that question. Your second one is writing therapy. I think it would be very presumptuous for any writer to assume what it means for somebody to read their book. It's one of the wonders of writing is you put it out there and you don't know how people are going to respond, and you can't imagine how they'd respond. And for me, the most instructive experience I've ever had as a writer was talking to an audience in Hargeisa and about this book about Assad, and getting incredibly nervous at the beginning, thinking, the story that I'm telling is these people's story. It's not mine, it's the audience's story, and how are they going to respond to me, this outsider, telling their story, and such a difficult one. And what they made of the story I'd never have imagined before. Every audience I've ever spoken to is so admiring of Assad. They say that he is strong to the point of being reckless. He never gave up hope. He was incredibly resilient. This audience said, what a stupid young boy. He was just knocked around. He had no maturity. He had no wisdom. And this is our story, and it's the worst story about us. And I was quite shocked. I didn't dream that would be the response. So who knows whether stories are therapeutic? It's really up to who reads them. And I don't think that it's an author can really imagine how their book's going to be read.
Hi, my name is Janet. I'm currently writing a story about a woman that I've met. And so hence the interest in coming to this session. So I'm going to ask you a piece of advice from seeing as you seem to have a lot of experience with this. So in her narrative, there are parts of her own story where she kind of doesn't really want to get into the detail because there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of anger, and there's a lot of, it's frustration, there's a lot of emotion. How do I push her, get her to dig into those moments, get past all that emotion to tell me the story? Is there a technique you can recommend?
So, I think this is really important. You don't need to know everything about another human being in order to write well about them. And that's so important. If you think of the books that you admire most and read them again and ask how much of the character do you actually know in the end? And often the answer is quite little. Often part of the power of a character is their mystery. Part of the power of a character is what is hidden. So the answer to that is in the writing. It's how one writes about the parts of a person you don't know about. And so, for instance, why a person won't tell you something can be enormously revealing. And if you can really interpret that, if that's where your interpretation is strongest, why is this person being silent? that can be incredibly illuminating. And so I think instead of trying to push and know everything and make somebody go where they just don't want to go, to answer the question, why don't they want to go there, can be a very powerful story in and of itself.
Okay, you have one more question. The lady in the middle, please.
Hello. Recently, there's been a news about a 19-year-old girl in South Africa. She's called Nene Mretanya. I don't know if you've heard about the news. She's a 19-year-old girl who was raped and murdered. And my question was, have you ever considered writing about women? Her story started a big conversation about that targets women, and many people participated in protests. And could we maybe expect a book about violence against women in the future?
Yeah, so this has been a huge story in South Africa. So two components to my answer, and one is that, I mean, all the books that I've written have been about men, and that's no coincidence. It's not for lack of trying, and I think that the reason is that almost everything that I've written has been about people very different from myself, people from quite different worlds, which is hard. And I think that what has happened, and this is just my sense of what has happened, is that a shared masculinity between me and the people I'm writing about is what has made the connection possible. And that's why I've been drawn to writing about men again and again. It has less been a choice than a weakness, I guess. It's the connection that I have, and therefore the one that I exploit. At the moment, I'm writing a book about a marriage between a man and a woman, between Nelson and Winnie Mandela. And this is completely different because they're both dead. So the research process is very, very different. And I'm really delighting in writing about her as a woman, in writing about her sexuality. She's an enormously interesting person. But I think that I'm freed from my own limitations and can do that because this is a very different form of writing. It is genuine historical writing. So that's my best answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation. I hope you have gotten answers to questions you might not have asked, but that I had a chance to preempt. Jonny, thank you very much for coming to Nairobi and to the Macondo Festival, and we hope we see you again. And we can't wait for your next book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.